Lynn, and I am studying to become a B.C.B.A. In today's video, we're going to jump into the new class for this semester, which is BEH 5043, also titled Measurements and Experimental Design. So in Unit 1, they just kind of reintroduce original concepts of the basic operations or components of behavioral analysis, which kind of mainly boil down to 6 basic items. So the first item is direct observation. So we can measure and we quantify different dimensions of behavior. So latency, duration, intensity, magnitude, frequency, those types of things. The second basic operation of behavioral analysis would be repeated measures. So this introduces the concept of a single subject design or single case design, depending on where you read it from, but it means the same thing. And that basically means there's a single subject and you manipulate their environment, and then you either take it away or you reintroduce something new or you change something, but you're always repeating the measure on that single subject. Basically, it compares to a lot of studies will study a large group of people and have statistical analysis versus a single subject and then performing a functional or graphical analysis on that end. We'll go more into that later on in later units. The third basic operation of behavior analysis is graphed data. So basically, as the saying goes, if you're not taking data, you're not doing ABA. So graph data is, as you can imagine, very crucial to what we do because it shows us graphically whether or not something is effective. Otherwise, you're just looking at a list of numbers. It's not going to help you. Number 4 is environmental manipulation. Now, that is, in its own definition, systematically changing the environment by manipulating either antecedents or consequences, right? So you're either changing the environment so that the SD preceding the behavior is different, or the consequence. So like if a kid screams and is used to getting attention, you now manipulate the environment to where if the kid screams, they don't get attention, and see if that either increases or decreases their behavior. Number 5 is systematic evaluation. So for single subject design, you control for extraneous variables, right? And the subject is their own control, right? You're not comparing them to anything else but themselves and their previous overall performance. So that is systematic evaluation. You're making sure that the entire design itself is valid and is useful and focuses on that subject and their behavior, and whether or not your systematic manipulations, right, actually made a difference in their behavior, and if you can directly correlate it to, with high confidence, that manipulation is the reason why their behavior either went up or down. The 6th and last element or basic operation of behavioral analysis is analysis and interpretation. So wouldn't have the word analysis in ABA if we didn't analyze everything, right? So what's the purpose of all this data we're taking? What are we trying to accomplish here? Well, we're usually trying to figure out how to either increase or decrease behavior or have a semi-permanent change that can be learned from the individual, right? In its core, it is visual analysis, because this unit we focus on single subject design. It's visual analysis to identify a functional relation. If the kid screams and they get attention, if we remove that attention, does the function change? Or was the function not attention? Was the function something else, right? So we have different ideas and different reasons to interpret the data that we take, and we analyze it and we see what was affected. Unit 1 goes on to discuss pragmatism within ABA practice. So remember that pragmatism is the philosophical assumption that holds truth of theories or beliefs are assessed by the success of the application of what we do. Basically, all that's saying is we assume what we do is right because of the data we've taken. We're being pragmatic about it. We don't assume it's right because we want it to be right. We assume it's right because we have the data to back it up. We're being very pragmatic about it. Once we discover something does not work or doesn't have the preferred effect, we go in and we change it, as long as all parties agree and as long as we can still change it. Within ABA practice, the biggest difference between ABA research and ABA practice, right? Research is usually laboratory setting and clinical study versus ABA practice is the application of the principles of behavior analysis to assess and improve socially significant behavior. The reason why ABA has such a turbulent history is because in the beginning, there wasn't really any validation towards what we were trying to do. It was just, are we getting these people to sit down, shut up, and do what we want them to? In an essence, yes, right? But also, where are their own rights? A person has a right to do anything they please, so to speak, as long as it's not hurting others. So are we training them like you would a circus animal to do that? Or are you actually giving them socially significant skills to be able to respond to society? ABA practice in and of itself, it relies on social acceptance, of understanding that what we're trying to accomplish is socially or culturally significant to the individual within the boundaries of their own social structure or culture. This excludes, bear this in mind, psychotherapy, cognitive therapy, neuropsychology, because that's not our wheelhouse. Behaviorism is not going to reach into those other areas and discuss them. Not to say that they are not valid, but ABA practice does not incorporate any of those elements into it. We don't incorporate psychotherapy or cognitive therapy or psychological testing into our practice because we don't have the skills or know-how to apply that. What we have is behaviorism. We see an antecedent, we see the behavior, we deal with the consequence, and we see what we have to manipulate to make sure that the environment suits the learner so that the learner learns how to respond appropriately to either the antecedent or the consequence. That being said, we target very specific behavior attributes. That is to say, what we aim to do with behaviors is we either replace them or weaken them. So if they're a non-preferred behavior according to society, right, like self-injurious behavior or screaming or disruptive behavior in general, we're going to try to replace that or weaken it. We may also try to develop a skill, right? So if a kid is trying to learn how to speak, we will try to assist in what we can to show them how to put the elements of sounds together in order to make a full man. So for instance, first you start off with a kid saying cookie, and you give them a cookie. So now they've learned, okay, if I say cookie, I get cookie. But then as time goes on, you can shape this behavior into saying cookie please. So you have them have a favorite toy, and then you can say like toy please, and then they say toy please, and then you can move on to say cookie please, and then you can keep shaping it to the point where a kid can potentially eventually say like, I would like to eat a cookie please. And then you can say, okay, wait. And there's no maladaptive behaviors. They understand that cookie is going to come soon. So that would be something of developing a skill, right? Stimulus control is another thing where basically if a behavior occurs at the wrong time or the wrong place. So going to the bathroom is an appropriate skill or behavior. But if you go to the bathroom 20 times a day, there is some sort of stimulus control issue going on, because unless it's a medical issue, right, you always consult a doctor first, because if they do legitimately have to go to the bathroom 20 times a day, that is not something we want to stop them from doing. But if they're just going, washing hands, or just staring at the ceiling for 5 seconds and then leaving, well, there's been a lack of stimulus control. They don't understand that it's either an internal issue that happens where they have to go to the bathroom, or for instance, they see the symbol of the bathroom sign and they're like, I have to go in there. You know, that's faulty stimulus control. Another thing we run is maintenance. So we've taught them the skill of, let's say, tying their shoes. Can they still do this 5, 10, 20 weeks, days, or months later? Has it maintained, right? And usually maintenance is actually a good indicator on whether something is socially significant or not. Tying shoes is actually an excellent example, because for some of my kids, tying shoes is not an important skill, even though they're 5, 6, 7, or 8, where you would expect them to tie shoes, because the parents have completely relied on either slip-on shoes or Velcro shoes. Not to say that's bad, it's simply to say that's no longer a socially valid skill for them to have, because if the whole family wears things like that, there's no point to them requiring to learn that. Now, if their school wants to teach them, that's fine, but we're not going to bust in and say like, well, the school told us to teach you this, so we're going to. We do what is socially significant for the individual, and that includes input from the family and from the client themselves if they can advocate for themselves, even at that young of age. Another one that we do is strengthening. So basically, if you're lacking mastery, so let's say you can tie shoes, but you always kind of mess up at that last part, or you kind of forget sometimes how to start the first knot, but you've got the first knot, then you can continue the rest on your own just fine. So we are going to strengthen those skills. We're going to practice those skills in multiple settings and making sure that this person can perform this skill that they want to do with greater mastery. So we're basically honing in and strengthening the skill. The last item that we do with behaviors is we generalize. Now this kind of goes a little bit hand in hand with stimulus control, but generalization basically means if a kid can recite the ABCs at a clinical setting that they learned it in, but they can't recite it anywhere else. That's a lack of generalization, right? That's another type of faulty stimulus control, right? So we help them generalize and teach them in multiple settings with multiple people to make sure that they understand that this skill is going to be an intrinsic thing that they have to stick for themselves and not apply just to that particular surrounding, right? Versus the other faulty stimulus control is, I'm going to do this one thing everywhere where you should only probably do it in one spot, right? So there's a wide range of effects that we try to accomplish with full target behaviors, but those are the main things that we're attempting to do. Finally, in Unit 1, it closed in with response definitions. So they discussed the two types of response definitions, which is functional. So a functional analysis would be done of describing what they do and why they do it. So what is the function? The child screams, receives cookie. That is a very functional thing because it explains exactly what happens. Versus topographical, you're describing what the behavior looks like. So child looks around room, sees mom, screams at an audible volume that can be heard from other room, and then mom supplied a cookie. So they're seem very similar, but one is more focused on why they're doing it. So child screams in order to receive cookie versus like you're describing every possible detail of what something looks like. Now, we've discussed at length the difference between functional and topographical, I guess, definitions, so to speak, in a previous unit, but basically just remember topography is what a behavior looks like. So anytime you hear topography, that is literally describing a series of movements or changes that a person performs that can be easily identified by other people. A fun thing if you want to try this is try to topographically describe a sneeze versus functionally describing a sneeze. They sneezed because their nose tickled and they're trying to get something out, versus topographical definition would be tilted their head back, their eyes rolled back slightly, they opened their mouths, and then with a very sudden force, they leaned forward, spit out, and exhaled. Very different definitions, but it's the exact same thing. Behavior. Right? With Unit 1, they describe how you define a target behavior, which is very important, as you can imagine. It needs to be able to be identified by multiple parties. So if you had 50 people watching the same subject, they should all be able to take data on the exact same behavior, and their inter-observer agreement should be very close to 90 or above %. So defining the target behavior is going to help you do that. So the first step is consider the characteristics of the behavior. Is it observable? Can multiple people see it? Like, what is the function of it? The second is decide what type of definition you want. Do you want a topographical definition or do you want a functional? Or in most cases, are you going to combine the two? Because usually it's best if they're married and you have kind of a little bit of both. You also, by the way, want to make sure you have a non-example thrown in there, such as hitting being when a child makes contact with a closed fist or open hand on another person. This does not include high fives. Right, so that's including a non-example. The third step in defining a target behavior is composing a written draft. So once you've defined the characteristics and once you've decided what type of definition you want, make a rough draft, right? Fourth is you try that rough draft and you modify as needed, or you go back to square one and try writing it out again. So the fourth step is basically try out what you've written. Step number 5 is determine how the definition is going to be measured. So you've defined this item, now how are you going to measure it? Frequency, latency, duration, how are we measuring this thing? Once again, we always have to quantify some sort of dimension of behavior. So make sure that not only is it observable, but it's quantifiable. And the last step is start your investigation with your target definition and modify as needed. Go back to step 1 or step 4 as required. Unit 1 closes with a description of what a response product is, also known as a permanent product, which is an observable permanent change in the environment after a response. So for instance, cigarette butts in an ashtray. You can see how many cigarettes have been smoked, or empty cans of soda left in a trash can. You can see how many sodas have been drank. That is one theoretical response definition, and that is considered, once again, permanent product, but it has its own faulty measures to it. For instance, what if your subject only smoked 1 cigarette, but there are 3 cigarette butts in the ashtray? Well, clearly other people can do it, right? Or what if you started count and there were already a large amount of empty cans of Coke in the trash can And so when you started counting, you needed to minus those out first, right? You need to start at 0 somewhere. So that's why they include the definition for a response product or a permanent product. I use those interchangeably because they are interchangeable according to most of the co-instructors. Some textbooks will say response product, and then other textbooks will say permanent product, and they might try to delineate between the two, but throughout the world of ABA, most people agree that you can just use those terms interchangeably because you're just describing things in the environment that have changed permanently because of a behavior. So it's a result of the behavior, right? It's a consequence of behavior, so it's something you can count, and it's technically a dimension you can measure. That's the end of Unit 1. I hope that was informative. This entire class I think was pretty interesting, so I liked how Unit 1 started with the basics. So if you have any questions, leave them down below, and until then, I'll see you in the next video.